Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini. I post weekly videos right here on my YouTube channel, and if you like what you see in this tutorial, make sure to click the subscribe button. Now in this video tutorial, I'm going to walk you through every single step of how to make my Gracie Saddle Bag. Alright, to get started with the Gracie Saddle Bag, you're first going to need to download the template that I created for you here, and I've included a link on where you can get it in the description box below the video, as well as that little lowercase letter I that you see on the top right hand corner of this video. So once you print it out, you definitely want to download it first and open it up to make sure that you're opening it in Adobe PDF Reader, and that way you know the templates will be the correct size that I designed them to be. Then you're going to cut both of these out, and I'm going to show you how to put them together. So I'll take my rotary cutter and a ruler to make sure I have some clean, straight cuts. Once you have both of the pieces cut out, you're going to get your paper glue stick or some double-sided tape and just put it right on that little edge there. And then you're going to take the other one and overlap them. Okay, and this is going to be the one template piece that you need to create the bag. So I designed this bag so that the front, let me show you, the front of the bag, this here, the back of the bag, and the flap are all created using the exact same template piece. So I thought this was a fun way to do it, so you only have one template piece, and I was able to make it work so that it looks really cute, and that round kind of half circle shape is repeated throughout the bag design. All right, so once you have this, then we're gonna head on over and start cutting our pieces out of our fabrics and our stabilizers so we can start making the Gracie Saddle Bag. Now using that template piece, you're going to want to cut out the fabrics you need for your lining, the woven interfacing, foam stabilizer, outer fabrics, and flap fabrics. There's quite a few different cuts that you need to make, so I've included all those instructions in the description box below for you. Use that link so it'll take you to the page where you know exactly what you need to cut from each fabric. So here are the three lining pieces, two of the same shape, which is going to be one side of the lining and the other, and then the gusset lining. All of these have already been fused with the fusible woven interfacing to the back side, okay, or the wrong side of the fabric. So those are the three pieces for the lining. For the outer fabric, I like to just lay it over my foam interfacing so that there's a little bit of space bigger, especially on both of the body pieces. This is going to be the fabric that we're going to use right here for the front and back of the body of our little Gracie saddle bag. And so at this point, I would recommend to baste it along all the outer edges to kind of set that fabric flat. And then you can go back and quilt it any way you want to, either with free motion type of stitching, or you can use your walking foot and do some straight lines. Whatever you wanted to do at that point would be fine. And I would just do it like this with one of your outer panels and the foam interfacing without any backing fabric. So if you want to quilt it now. If you don't want to quilt it and you just want to baste these layers together, we're going to stitch super close to the outer edge of both of these pieces. Alright, so I've basted both of these down onto the foam interfacing, alright, and now I'll go back and carefully following along the edge of the fabric so that I'm not cutting off any more than I need to. I'm going to trim away the excess foam. So after those two outer panels are set, you're going to repeat the same process for the only remaining outer piece that you have left. This is the front, the back, and then we need that strip of the gusset. So here I've already cut the fabric that I'm going to use for the gusset, but because it's on the outer portion of the bag, it also needs to be backed with the foam stabilizer. So I'm going to do the same thing we just did for the other ones by laying it on here, giving myself a little bit of space, cutting it a little bit bigger on all sides. And I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and baste this down again and then trim flush close to the outer edges of the fabric so that we have three completely backed outer panel pieces that we need to complete the bag. All right, so now we have our lining pieces, two for the bottom bag portion of the bag, and the gusset, and all three of these have been backed with the fusible woven interfacing. Then we have the outer part of the bag that's going to make up the bag body here, and that should be two identical pieces basted to the foam, and then also the gusset. Now let's move on to the next part of the bag, the flap. Okay, now moving on to the flap of our Gracie Saddle Bag. You're going to need 2 pieces of fabric cut out to the same template that you use for the body part. I designed the bag so that the shape that you see here is the exact same shape you need for the flap. So it's real simple and straightforward to make. So you'll need fabric for the outside of the flap and a fabric for the lining of the flap. And so for me, I've chosen this tossed dandelion print from my Dominicana collection. Same kind of red on red, just a different print from this one. We've cut 2 with the same template. Again, I've cut my foam interfacing to a little bit bigger. And I'm just going to lay one of these here. I'm going to draw some random lines here on a diagonal. And I kind of just start anywhere. And then from that first line, I will start measuring whatever the distance is that I want my lines to be spaced. So I'm going to do, I think, 1.5 inches wide. All right, and I'm going to go back and do the opposite for some complete cross hatching here. All right, now I'm going to put in, I think, this red thread in my machine, and I'm going to stitch right on all the lines that I just drew out. And after quilting it, I just press away all those tailor's chalk marks, then carefully follow the edge of the fabric to trim away any of the excess foam. Now that the outer portion of our flap here has been quilted, you should have one that has fabric quilted to the foam interfacing, and then the lining should just be by itself. Now I'm going to take that lining piece that's going to be for the inside lining of the flap, and I'm going to cut a piece that matches same size of our fusible woven interfacing. Then get your pressing board and iron out and go ahead and fuse it to the wrong side of the fabric. Okay, so the outer flap has been quilted to the foam stabilizer. Then you have the lining part of the flap that's just been fused to the woven interfacing, just like we did our lining pieces. And so this is going to look like this. The quilted part facing out, so that's what you're looking at, and then the lining on the inside. Now notice the lining is what's going to have one end, or the male end, of the magnetic snap installed into it. And you need to do that before you put the whole thing together. Otherwise, the hardware installation will show up on this outside portion. So let's prep that, and then we'll move on to making our piping here before we can put the flap together. Now, a quick overview of the hardware. Here are the parts that you're going to need for the magnetic snap, and depending on what you're using, it might be slightly different than what you see here. But here I have the male end and then the female end of the snap. The bigger washer here goes to that one, and the smaller one goes to the male end. Now for the installation of the male end of the snap, we're going to be working with, in my case here, the smaller ones. You need the male end with whatever washer, or if you don't have a washer, that's all right. They're optional, but it does help if your set came with them. Now remember, if you're needing any of the supplies and materials that I'm including in this video tutorial, you can always use the link in the description box below, or hit the little letter I that you see on the top right hand corner, and that will take you to where you can get everything you need to make this Gracie Saddle Bag. Now we're going to be making some marks on just the lining piece. So this is not the quilted one. You can set that one aside. Just the lining piece of the flap. We're first going to fold it in half this way to basically find the halfway point so we have it nice and centered. And I'm just kind of scratching along the fold here on the edge that's curved, because that's the side that flaps down when you're closing and opening the bag. So we open it, I have a crease line there. From that center crease mark, you can measure up however high you want to. This is a lot going to be personal preference, but I find that about 1.5 inches to 2 inches works well for me. So I am going to make a little mark here. So I'm laying the tip of the curved edge that sticks out the most, which is right in the center here, right where my line is. I'm going to put that at the 1.5 inch mark and just make my kind of my intersecting point here, so I know exactly where 1.5 inches up and centered is, and that is the point for that. Now I'm going to take the little washer, and right where the crosshairs are of the mark that I made, I'm going to center that in that center circle. Okay, because that is exactly where I want the male end of it to be, at least in proportion to where the center of the flap is. And then the two little slits that are here on the side, go ahead and mark them. That's the part that we're going to cut to make space for the prongs of the magnetic snap to slip in through. Now to make the slits, I simply take a seam ripper, watch your fingers on the back end, and just insert the point and then just kind of slide it enough to make a little slip. You don't need the slit to be too big. It's just enough for those prongs to fit in. And if you kind of have to work it to get the prongs in, that's even better. You just don't want to have a slit that's extended past. So you're going to take the male end of the snap and we're going to slip the prongs through. You see that went through nice and easily. We don't see any of the marks and we don't see any slits on this end, so that's good. We're going to flip it over. And now, because we only have one layer of interfacing and fabric here, I like to kind of grab a little chunk of my foam, something like that. A little bit bigger, okay? And if you want, you can just kind of press down on it so you get the markings of it. Turn it over, same thing. Cut in there with the seam ripper. And just be careful you don't cut yourself. So when you do, you slip the washer or the male end through the fabric, you can add a buffer or not. I tend to add it even if I do have a washer like this, but then I slide the washer on top, of course, if you have it, and then go ahead and press those prongs out. Some people, again, I said, like to press them in towards the center. It doesn't really matter. But there it is in place. Either one of these ways will work, okay? And you can see that the male end is properly installed. Now we're ready to move on to the next step. All right, so for our flap, we have the portion that's going to be on the outside that's been quilted. We have the lining piece that has the interfacing fused and the male end of the magnetic snap installed. And you can see that this is how it's going to look once it's done. And so what we're needing next is to make and attach our piping that's going to be sandwiched in between both of these layers. I have my 18-inch by 18-inch square piece of fabric here that we're going to use to cut up and make the bias piping here. So first we need to cut some bias strips, and the reason for that is because this flap is rounded, and if you cut on the crosswise grain or on the lengthwise grain, you're going to see some puckering and kind of like rippling in the fabric itself because it's not allowing for the maximum amount of stretch in the grain of the fabric. The maximum amount of stretch is going to be along the bias, and that's where we want to cut our strip, basically a strip that goes this way. Now to cut our bias strips, I'm just going to take the square, fold it in half along the diagonal, like this. So this is my 45-degree angle. And some people take a really long strip ruler and start, cut away the fold and then start cutting from there. I like to kind of make this a little bit more manageable. So I will pull this corner up to the top, so it's a smaller triangle, and then I'll turn it. So I have a 90-degree angle right here, basically a backwards L right in front of me. It allows me an easier way to manage cutting strips, and all the folds are right here, so I can cut them away with one cut. So I'm just going to scoop my ruler in a little bit just to get rid of some of that fold there because I want individual strips. So I cut away the fold. And now, depending on how wide you need your bias strips, this is the distance that you'll go over here and then cut. And these strips, all the ones that will be here, will be already cut on the bias. Now the bias strips that we need to cut from here are going to have to fit around the piping, whatever type of trim that you're using. The one that I'm using here is pretty thin, which is kind of the look that I prefer and like, but depending on how thick the trim is that you're using to fill in your piping, that's going to determine how wide you need to cut your strips. So for me, I like to cut my strips at 1 1/4 inches wide or 1 1/2. So I'm going to take my little ruler here, measure 1 1/4 inches over from this freshly cut edge, okay? And I'm just going to cut across. And if you'll notice, I end up with 2 strips, right? Because we folded that big square initially, we folded it twice. So you're only going to need 1 bias strip that measures at least 21 inches in length. So I like to do it in start off with a bigger square like this so that when I do cut the strip, it's just one solid continuous strip. But if you're trying to be, conserve a little bit more on fabric, or you have a specific fabric print you'd like to use, feel free to cut multiple strips on the bias and then you can piece them together to get the length that you need. But I can see that one of these is going to be more than enough to go around the entire curve here of the flap of the bag. Now to prep the little bias piping that we're going to make, before we head over to the sewing machine, I'm going to take the bias strip and whatever trim or cording you're going to use to fill it in with. And you want them both to be at least 21 inches. Make it a little bit longer because you can always trim it back. Now here's the way that I like to do it. I will take my Elmer's glue, just the regular white washable glue. And you can either like fold this in half and find yourself the crease line so you know exactly where to lay your piping. I'm just going to do it lightly to give me a rough halfway point. I don't want to press it with the iron just yet. Then you can go in here and just do a little bead of glue down that center crease line to help hold the cording or piping or drawstring, whatever you're using in here, to stay in place. That's just going to help keep it from moving on you too much. Now I like to add a little bit of glue on the opposite end here because I'm going to bring the top edge of the fabric towards me. So I'm holding the little cording in there so it doesn't move, and I'm bringing it, the top edge of the fabric, to match the bottom raw edge. So that is sandwiched in there. And so then I push with my nails to make sure that that piping is all the way back that way and against the crease line, okay? At this point, since the piping, the cording up part of it is not exposed, I can just hit it with the iron to kind of set that glue. And it's just one strip, so it might seem a little fussy, but really I find this to be helpful. If you have your own way of doing it that works for you, go ahead and do that. But if you've never tried it before, take the time out to do this and see if it makes it a little bit easier for you. Now, if you're familiar with some more traditional ways of creating your own piping, you may recall doing something like this, where then you go back and you stitch it so that it holds both layers of the fabric together, and then you stitch it into the seam where it's going to be. Sometimes what happens is that the first stitch line to hold the fabric layers together ends up showing through after the piping is installed. And so I find that by glue basting it in place like this, there's no actual stitching. So as long as you ensure that you're getting nice and close up into this piping here, so that it's a nice filled in piping sewn into the seam, I find that you won't have that problem because there are no stitches that could potentially show through. Hey, I just wanted to jump in right here to give you some additional information. If you're enjoying this Gracie Saddle Bag tutorial and you like my teaching style where I show you every single step of the way to completing your project, then you may want to check out the other online courses that I have for other types of handbags. Some feature crossbody bags, smaller ones, ones with a ton of different pockets, some that are great for traveling with, to use as your carry-on. And as you can see, there's so many different techniques that I teach you as we're creating every single one of these bags. This is my Reina barrel bag, which is a very, very popular one. A lot of my students love this one. Interior lined pockets like you see on this Lorraine bucket bag. This is a really cute one where you can see the closure features drawstring with grommets that are installed. So I show you how to install grommets, rivets, fully lined pockets on the interior, different types of handles. I have several other handbag online courses. They're super affordable. Your access to the content never expires. So you can sign up for a class today, and then when you have some time later on this year, you can sit down and watch it at any time that you want, and you will always have access to the class indefinitely. Now, all my online video courses have step-by-step video lessons, as well as downloadable pattern templates and supplemental print instructions that accompany every single one of my handbag designs. So that's it. I just wanted to let you know that there are some other handbag courses that you can sign up for in my online shop. If you want to check those out, I'll leave you a link in the description box below, or you can click on the lowercase letter I that you see in the top right-hand corner. Now, let's get right back to the Gracie Saddle Bag tutorial. Now, when it comes to attaching the piping to the flap here, we are going to grab all the pieces that we need, the outer part, the lining piece, and the piping that we've made so far. Just start by sandwiching the layers together. So we are going to put both of these pieces, pretty side of the fabric facing up. The piping is going to go on the outer part of the flap so that the raw edges of your bias strip and the raw edges of the flap itself are touching. So we're going to go like this. And because my strips are longer, I'm just going to extend it past this straight edge so that I can go back and trim away the excess once I'm done. So the idea is that then we take this one pretty side face down, and we're sandwiching the piping in between the two fabric layers here of our flap. And I like to start in the center just to make sure that the curve of the flap here is evenly distributed. Here you can go ahead and attach clips or pins, and you just want to line up the raw edges super close and kind of go clipping it or pinning it all the way around to work your way around the full curve of that flap. And now that we have these 3 layers clipped into place, we're going to head over to the sewing machine and install our zipper foot. Now the reason for the zipper foot is because it doesn't have that much additional bulk that won't allow you to get as close as I'd like you to get to the cording that is caught inside the piping. So you'll be able to get really nice and up close in here for the stitching. That's going to give you a nice professional and clean looking finish in the piping once we flip this out. We're only going to be sewing around the curved edge. So make sure that you backstitch at the beginning and at the ends. And then I want you to leave this top edge open because we're going to reach in here to flip this flap out, okay? Once we're done with the stitching line. So right here, I just want you to stitch as close as you can to the piping or to the cording that you see that raised bump in there without stitching on it. Okay, so as close as you can get to that all the way around the curve. All right, so now that that's been stitched, if you see, I just took it little by little, and you can see that right after the stitch line is where that bump of the cording gets caught, okay, all the way there. We can trim away the excess that's sticking out at the top. So this is what we have left. Now we're going to reach in here and flip this out. But before we can do that, the seam allowance that we have left here is a little bit too much so that this will be able to push out nice and smooth. So a few different options. You can take some pinking shears if you have a pair that will go through this bulk and kind of trim this down, or you can cut with a pair of scissors close to the edge here. I typically will go with the rotary cutter and just trim it, kind of split that seam allowance in half to get rid of some of that bulk. Just be careful. Since you are going through a lot of bulk, you want to make sure you have a sharp blade and don't cut yourself. Now we're going to reach in here and flip this all right side out and give it a good press. And you can see, because we skipped that basting step, when you pull back here, you don't see any basting stitches. So if you've ever installed piping or made your own piping where when you pull back like this on the finished piping, you see stitches, now you know why. So give that glue basting technique a try, and you may find that really helps you with that, because you skip a whole row of stitching, all right? So I'm really happy with the way that this looks. Now we're just gonna go to the sewing machine and just base stitch across the top edge, really close to the top, so that we can hold these 2 layers together. All right, so our outer flap is complete. We basted this shut, so everything is just in one piece put together. You can set that aside, and now we move on to the fun part, which is constructing the outer body piece of the Gracie bag.